I thought deflation was always good and inflation was always bad. Isn't that the talking points that always come out from the libertarian side or even just the general conservative side?
Right.
Inflation always bad.
Yeah, it depends on. I mean, I don't, I don't know if that's a fair representation of all the Austrians' arguments, but they tend to think that deflation is good, yeah, and inflation is always bad. But it depends on what's the cause of the inflation, right? And also it depends on what your definition. So here we already have a problem, right? The Austrians, they just say if the money supply goes up, it's inflation, and if it goes down, it's deflation.
Which is it's a reflexive thing to say. Like
Right.
inflation is the money supply increasing, and then they turn around and say, well, inflation increases the money supply. Well, yes, you just defined it as that.
Right. So then you end up being right by definition, but how is that useful to you in your investment decisions specifically, in your predictions for Federal Reserve policy, interest rates, stock market prices, corporate profits, etc.? How is that useful? It's actually, in my opinion, not very useful. So deflation can be the result, as Carol Quigley also notes, can be the result of an industrial boom and an output boom that pushes prices down very fast so that the aggregate price level comes down. But it could also be the outcome of a demand shock, which comes due to um, austerity, basically.
Right.
If the government imposes a tax and doesn't provide enough money to pay the tax and for people to save enough to feel comfortable with their future, then a sort of government imposed austerity ensues, which is basically government depriving the private sector of the money it needs to be comfortable. The private sector will demand fewer goods and services. Businesses will sell less and lay off people. And then when people get laid off, they have even less money, and turns into this spiral until the problem of a lack of net private savings is resolved by the government, which is the only source of that said net private savings. If you
Right.
don't have an export surplus.
Right. And then, another thing that, you say that what I said about Austrians and libertarians regarding their theories on inflation might not be totally accurate, but I will say in my anecdotal experience, and I used to be like this, talking to any Austrian or libertarian about economics is that they very quickly start hyperventilating about inflation. And
Yeah, right. Because what's bad? Like this is Tom Wood's argument. What's bad if my pair of jeans goes down from $50 to $25? Isn't that great? So doesn't everyone benefit?
well, we're going to go ahead in specifics why everyone doesn't benefit there. But the other argument is that inflation erodes savings, right? If you save up money and I save up $100 and then the purchasing power gets cut in half, that means I only have $50, relatively speaking. And I mean, that's true, but what if people haven't saved? I mean, what if there's no money to save? Right? That implies there's savings to be had, right? And if the money hasn't been created at the same level that the economy needs that money, or I guess we should say in more MMT terms, if the government hasn't issued enough private sector net savings where the private sector can save in aggregate, well, then what savings is getting inflated here? And emphasis
Right.
in aggregate. I know this person or that person might have some savings, right? And the point that I'm trying to make here isn't that therefore inflation is good. I'm saying this is complicated. There's a lot of moving pieces, and instead of just saying inflation bad or deflation good or something like that, let's get into the nuance and see what's going on here, because I know from, we'll call it the conspiracy theory angle, is that the inflation is a stealth tax because the people close to the money creation source get to print money out of nothing, spend it at today's value, and then everybody else who gets the money later gets it at the inflated value. Therefore, that's another reason why inflation is bad. But what E. Michael Jones is making the argument here for is that it's the other way around, because deflation benefits the creditor, right? If I lend you $100 today and tomorrow the dollar is worth twice as much, that means you got to work twice as hard to pay me that money back. Right? And so to what your example of what Tom Woods either said or you paraphrased him saying, if I got a pair of jeans that I had to spend $50 yesterday, but now I can spend $25 today, who does that not benefit? It doesn't benefit the jean maker who bought everything and got loans to buy all those things. He bought inventory and all this stuff, and he paid wages, expecting that he was going to make $50 a pair. Tomorrow comes, he can only charge $25 a pair. Well, the loan that he got doesn't deflate.
It depends. It depends, because what if the jeans maker chose to outcompete his competitors and sells the jeans at a lower price? Because he's figured out, he's enhanced his productivity, he can produce so much more jeans, he can outcompete everyone.
Right. Well,
that is an example where, for the example I just gave is an example where deflation is not necessarily bad. Good. Yeah. But in many cases, it comes out of demand, a lack of demand, which is induced by government austerity programs.
I want to say some evidence right here. This is going back to E. Michael Jones. He's pretty critical of deflation. I mean, like you said, there could be some time. I mean, this is complicated, but he's pointing out that when you have a gold standard,
well, most of the time through history, it's been bad.
Yes.
So yeah.
Well, let's give an example of that right here. So he's basically saying what I just described before is if you pay a bunch of money as a outfit of some sort. With a projection price to sell in the future, and everything deflates by the time you get there, it really screws you up. Here's an example. So a person who borrowed $1,000 to buy a farm in 1868 would not only have to grow I need to read something before here. The mechanics of deflation were simple, inexorable, and best of all, invisible to its victims. Did I say inflation or deflation? I meant whatever I said. I meant to say deflation. The mechanics of deflation were simple, inexorable, and best of all, invisible to its victims. During the last quarter of the 19th century, both population and production increased while the money supply was held constant. Doubling productivity while holding the money supply constant would cause the price of a bushel of wheat to be cut in half. And in addition, since money was now scarcer than before, interest rates would necessarily rise. And to an asterisk with that, I do think this is true in contrary to what we've said before, because there's no Federal Reserve System at this point.
Well, under a gold standard or something like it, yeah, it's true. Or if you have an international exchange standard,
yes,
then yeah, it's true.
To continue, the upshot of this policy was clear. This is getting back to what I started reading. A person who borrowed $1,000 to buy a farm in 1868 would not only have to grow twice as much wheat in 1888 to earn the same mortgage payment he made earlier, he would be repaying his loan in dollars that had twice as much purchasing power as the depreciated currency he had originally borrowed. Thus, while contraction was a blessing to the banker creditors, it placed a cruel and exploitative burden on the nation's producer debtors. Again, this, the Austrian view, and honestly, this is the neoclassical view, because this stems from Adam Smith, where you have this equilibrium that's always being sought within the economy, this invisible hand. It's bullshit. There's no such thing as this equilibrium. There's no such thing as this invisible hand. So this idea that, okay, when the value of a currency deflates, the whole ocean's gonna go down at the same time, and everything's gonna deflate in equilibrium at the same time. It doesn't, right? And he goes on to say that where was it? That basically gold can never keep pace with human productivity, and he claims that the gold standard is synonymous with usury, but just as human productivity cannot keep up with the compound interest of usury, the money supply, if it's based on gold, can't keep up with human productivity. So inevitably, we get in the situation where the farmer lacks liquidity to get himself
Yeah.
through the season.
Yeah, and that illustrates another point, which is that this constant battle in the economies throughout history between these three classes: banking, industry, and agriculture. Right? Agriculture hates deflation and has no problem with inflation, really, because they're the first to sell all the goods that inflate in price
Right.
when inflation happens. Industry also doesn't really have a problem with inflation. Bankers, they have a big problem with inflation because they have made loans at a fixed rate and they want to preserve the value of the money that they're banking on for the next decades or more. So they are more into deflation, and all everything else be damned, basically. I mean, that's just the natural incentives that these different players have in the system. And Carol Quigley also writes about. Actually, I found the section where he talks about this a little bit as well. If you want me to,
I do, but let me finish this point from Dr. E. Michael Jones, because he wraps it up in this sentence. As a result, the farmer, and this is exactly what you just said, or the other side of what you just said. As a result, the farmer was forced to borrow more and more just in order to survive, but in an age of deflation, this meant that the money borrowed at higher and higher interest rates had to be packed with money earned more and more laboriously. Right? This again, we're looking at what's the real source of what's going on here, the real source of value. It's the labor. More and more labor is having to be applied to deal with this deflation, because lower and lower commodity they had to work more laboriously because of lower and lower commodity prices. As a result, the farmer found it impossible to keep up and often lost his farm to creditors. I mean, how many times have we seen that play out?
yeah, that's what deflation puts people in a bind, and they have to sell things, and then who ends up snapping that all up? It's the bankers.
Right.
Quigley
Give us some
writes,
Quigley.
Quigley writes here in Tragedy and Hope, page 57. Throughout modern history, the influence of the gold standard has been deflationary, because the natural output of gold each year, except in extraordinary times, has not kept pace with the increase in output of goods. Only new supplies of gold, or the suspension of the gold standard in wartime, or the development of new kinds of money, like notes and checks, which economize the use of gold, have saved our civilization from steady price deflation over the last couple of centuries. As it was, we had two long periods of such deflation we had two such periods of deflation from 1818 to 1850 and from 1872 to about 1897. The three surrounding periods of inflation, 1790 through 1870, 1850 through 1872, 1897 through 1921, were caused by, number one, the wars of the French Revolution and Napoleon, when most countries were not on gold. Number two, the new gold strikes of California and Alaska in 1949-1950, followed by a series of wars which included the Crimean War of 1954 through 1956, the Austrian-French War of 1859, the American Civil War of 1861 through 1865, the Austro-Prussian and Franco-Prussian Wars of 1866 and 1870, and even the Russo-Turkish War of 1877. And number three, the Klondike and Transvaal gold strikes of the late 1890s, supplemented by the new cyanide method of refining gold, about 1897, and a series of wars from the Spanish-American War of 1898 through 1899, the Boer War of 1899 through 1902, and the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 through 1905, to the almost uninterrupted series of wars in the decade from 1911 through 1921. In each case, the three great periods of war ended with an extreme deflationary crisis, 1890, 1873, 1921, as the influential money power persuaded governments to re-establish a deflationary money unit.
Exactly what Dr. Jones just said here.
Exactly.
Yep.
With a high gold content. The obsession of the money power with deflation was partly a result of their concern with money rather than with goods, but was also founded on other factors, one of which was paradoxical. The paradox arose from the fact that the basic economic conditions of the 19th century were deflationary, with a money system based on gold and an industrial system pouring out increasing supplies of goods. But in spite of falling prices, with its increasing value of money, the interest rate tended to fall rather than to rise. This occurred because the relative limiting of the supply of money in business was not reflected in the world of finance, where excess profits of finance made excess funds available for lending. Moreover, the old traditions of merchant banking continued to prevail in financial capitalism even to its end in 1931. It continued to emphasize bonds rather than equity security stocks, to favor government issues rather than private offerings, and to look to foreign rather than to domestic investments. Until 1825, government bonds made up almost the whole of securities of the London Stock Exchange. I mean, that's something we've talked about also. The stock market hasn't always been this important thing, right? Until 1925, government bonds made up almost the whole of securities of the London Stock Exchange. In 1843, such bonds, usually foreign, were 80% of the securities registered. In 1875, they were still 68%. The funds available for such loans were so great that there were in the 19th century sometimes riots by subscribers seeking opportunities to buy security flotations, and offerings from many remote places and obscure activities commanded a ready sale. The excess of savings led to a fall in the price necessary to hire money, so that the interest rate on British government bonds fell from 4% to 3%, blah, 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 blah.
Getting granular in his detail there.
Yeah. All this served to strengthen the merchant bankers' obsession both with government influence and with deflation, which would increase value of money and interest rate.